The first-class cabin fell silent as Elijah Carter stood in the aisle, boarding pass in hand. He wore a simple navy blue sweater and khaki pants, comfortable clothes for the long flight home after visiting his parents for their 50th anniversary. At 45, Elijah's short-cropped hair showed touches of gray at the temples, and the subtle lines around his eyes told stories of both laughter and hardship. The flight attendant's welcoming smile vanished when she saw him. Her name tag read Rebecca, though everyone called her Reese. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform perfectly pressed. "Sir, I think you're confused. This is first class," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her tone carried a hint of amusement, as if catching someone in an embarrassing mistake. Several passengers glanced up from their pre-flight routines. A businessman in an expensive suit raised an eyebrow. An older woman clutched her designer handbag a little tighter. Elijah had experienced this before. 20 years as one of the few black test pilots in the Navy had prepared him for these moments. He didn't raise his voice or show frustration. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. 14A window seat, he said calmly, pointing to the seat number printed on the ticket. Reese frowned and took the boarding pass from his hand, examining it as if searching for signs of forgery. Her red-painted nails tapped against the paper. "How did you get this seat?" she asked, with a particular emphasis on "you" that made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken assumptions. A young woman sitting nearby looked down at her phone, pretending not to hear. An elderly gentleman across the aisle watched with disapproval in his eyes, though it wasn't clear toward whom. "I booked it, like everyone else," Elijah replied simply. He kept his voice even, though he'd answered this question too many times in his life. Reese handed the boarding pass back with obvious reluctance. "Very well," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. Elijah stored his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his window seat. The leather was soft and spacious, a rare luxury he allowed himself after decades of military transport flights where comfort was never a consideration. As the remaining passengers boarded, Elijah noticed something concerning. His years of experience with aircraft had fine-tuned his senses to the normal sounds and vibrations of flight. The left engine had an unusual pitch, a subtle irregularity most passengers would never notice. It wasn't immediately dangerous, but it deserved attention before takeoff. When Reese passed by checking seatbelts, Elijah raised his hand to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I believe there might be an issue with the left engine. The sound pattern is irregular." Reese's professional smile didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, please leave aviation to the professionals," she said with a dismissive smirk. "I can assure you everything has been thoroughly checked by our maintenance crew." The businessman across the aisle chuckled quietly. Embarrassment flashed through Elijah, quickly replaced by concern. 20 years of flying experimental aircraft had taught him to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. "I understand," Elijah said, "but I think our pilots have thousands of hours of experience." Reese interrupted, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "They're more than capable of identifying any issues." Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. Elijah fell silent. He'd made his attempt. Pushing further would only create a scene, and he'd been in enough of those in his lifetime. Instead, he turned his attention to the window. Dark storm clouds gathered on the horizon, their heavy gray masses threatening the flight path. The weather report had mentioned possible turbulence, but these clouds looked more serious than predicted. Combined with the engine irregularity, it made Elijah uneasy. As the safety demonstration began, Elijah noticed how Reese avoided eye contact with him. The other passengers had already forgotten the small confrontation, returning to their books, tablets, and pre-flight drinks. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. The irregular sound from the left engine continued, perhaps even intensified. Elijah gripped the armrests slightly, his trained instincts on alert. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently third in line for takeoff. The captain's voice announced over the intercom. "We expect some turbulence as we climb through those storm clouds, but we'll do our best to find a smooth route. Flight time today is approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Elijah closed his eyes briefly. After countless missions and emergency situations, he'd developed a ritual of quiet focus before each flight. But today, that focus was interrupted by genuine concern. The wheels lifted off the tarmac, and the aircraft climbed steadily into the darkening sky. Through his window, Elijah watched the gathering storm clouds growing closer. Whatever was wrong with the engine, they were now committed to the flight, heading straight toward rough weather with a potentially compromised aircraft. Elijah took a deep breath and prepared himself for what might come. 3 hours into the flight, most passengers had settled into the routine of long-distance travel. Some watched movies on their screens, others had fallen asleep, and a few worked on laptops. The seatbelt sign had been on for the past hour as the plane navigated through patches of turbulence, but nothing severe enough to cause real concern. Elijah had barely touched his meal. The irregular engine sound had grown more pronounced, developing a metallic whine that vibrated through the aircraft's frame. He'd given up trying to alert the crew after a second attempt was met with an even colder dismissal from Reese. The businessman across the aisle, who'd introduced himself as Martin, leaned over. "First time flying. The noises can be scary if you're not used to them." Before Elijah could respond, a terrifying bang shook the aircraft. The sound was deafening, like a bomb had exploded somewhere in the fuselage. The plane dropped suddenly, as if the floor had disappeared beneath them. Drinks, laptops, and anything not secured went flying toward the ceiling. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments, swinging wildly with the plane's violent movements. Children screamed. A woman 3 rows ahead began praying loudly. The cabin lights flickered, then dimmed to emergency lighting. "This is Captain Mercer," came a strained voice over the intercom. The captain's usually confident tone was replaced with something tense and frightened. "We've lost." The announcement cut off abruptly, leaving passengers in terrified suspense. The plane rolled sharply to the left. Outside Elijah's window, he could see the left engine was damaged, pieces of its housing torn away. Smoke streamed backward, dissipating into the storm clouds around them. Elijah quickly pulled his oxygen mask on, then helped the elderly woman beside him, who was struggling with shaking hands. The plane continued to shake violently, dropping in altitude with each passing moment. Minutes later, the head flight attendant, Sandra, rushed through the cabin with a first aid kit. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by barely contained panic. Her uniform was stained with what looked like coffee, and a cut above her eye was bleeding slightly. As she passed his row, Elijah reached out and grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice muffled but clear enough through the oxygen mask. Sandra stopped, looking around to ensure other passengers weren't listening, but everyone was too concerned with their own survival to eavesdrop. Her professional mask slipped completely. "Both pilots are down," she whispered, voice trembling. "Captain had a stroke during the initial turbulence. The co-pilot was trying to handle things alone, but he hit his head hard when we experienced that explosion. He's unconscious and bleeding badly." Elijah's military training kicked in immediately. "Who's flying the plane?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "The autopilot for now, but it's struggling with the damage," Sandra replied. "We've lost the left engine completely, and several systems are failing. Air traffic control is trying to talk us through emergency procedures, but..." The plane lurched downward again, more severely this time. A wave of screams filled the cabin. The aircraft's nose dipped at a dangerous angle. Sandra grabbed the intercom handset with shaking hands. She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering courage, then pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice wavering. "We have an emergency situation." She paused, swallowed hard, then continued. Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Anyone at all? Passengers looked around frantically. A young man raised his hand halfway, then lowered it, shaking his head. "Just flight simulator games," he said quietly. Martin, the businessman, looked at Elijah. "You seem to know something was wrong earlier. Do you fly?" Before Elijah could answer, the plane shuddered violently again. The overhead bins burst open, spilling bags into the aisle. A child wailed somewhere in the back of the plane. Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, steady despite the plane's continued shaking. His military bearing was evident in his calm demeanor and confident posture. Years of crisis training had prepared him for moments like this. Reese, who had been trying to secure loose items in the galley, turned and saw him standing. Her eyes widened in disbelief, first at seeing someone standing during such severe turbulence, then in recognition of who it was. "Sir, you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened," she shouted over the noise of the struggling aircraft and frightened passengers. Elijah ignored her, turning to Sandra instead. "Lieutenant Commander Elijah Carter, United States Navy test pilot," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon of hope. 20 years experience with experimental and commercial aircraft. "Take me to the cockpit." Sandra's relief was instantaneous and visible. "Thank God," she whispered. Reese stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as the realization hit her. The man she had dismissed and humiliated hours earlier might be their only chance at survival. "Follow me immediately," Sandra said, already moving toward the cockpit. "We're losing altitude fast." As Elijah followed her through the tilting aisle, passengers began to understand what was happening. Some reached out to touch his arm as he passed, like believers seeking blessing from a saint. Others simply watched with desperate hope in their eyes. Martin gave him a thumbs up. "Show them what you can do," he said. The plane entered another pocket of turbulence, throwing Sandra against a seat. Elijah caught her, keeping them both upright through the violent motion. "We have less than 20 minutes before our situation becomes unrecoverable," she said quietly, so only he could hear. 238 people. Please tell me you can save them." Elijah's expression remained calm, but determined. "Take me to the cockpit now," he repeated. "We don't have time to waste." The cockpit door swung open to reveal a scene of absolute chaos. Captain Mercer lay slumped in his seat, his face pale and slack on one side. Clear signs of a stroke. The first officer was sprawled across the center console, a deep gash on his forehead, still seeping blood that had splattered across the instruments. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the acrid scent of electrical equipment overheating. Warning lights flashed across every panel, bathing the cockpit in an eerie red glow. Alarms buzzed and beeped in an overwhelming cacophony. Through the windshield, dark storm clouds swirled, occasionally lit by flashes of lightning that illuminated the cockpit in stark white bursts. Elijah took in the scene in seconds, his trained mind cataloging details and priorities without hesitation. He gently moved the unconscious first officer, checking his pulse before carefully laying him on the floor. "He's alive but needs medical attention quickly," Elijah said to Sandra, who immediately began first aid procedures. Elijah slid into the captain's seat, his hands moving with practiced precision across the unfamiliar controls. 20 years of test piloting had taught him to adapt to different aircraft quickly. His fingers flew over switches, adjusting settings and disabling the most intrusive alarms. "I need everyone to be quiet," he commanded, his voice firm but calm. The plane lurched again, dropping several hundred feet in seconds. Sandra stumbled but kept working on the injured co-pilot. Behind them, Reese stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of shock and fear. Elijah strapped himself in and put on the headset. He scanned the instruments methodically, building a mental picture of their situation. The left engine was completely dead, just as he'd suspected from the sounds earlier. The right engine was straining, operating at 140% of recommended output. Fuel was limited due to the increased consumption. The hydraulic system was compromised, making the controls sluggish. And all around them, the storm was intensifying. Current altitude 28,000 feet, descending at 500 feet per minute, he muttered to himself. Need to stabilize. His hands moved deliberately across the controls, coaxing the wounded aircraft into a more stable descent. The violent shaking gradually eased, though the plane still trembled with turbulence. Sandra finished bandaging the co-pilot's head and secured him with spare straps. She moved to the jump seat behind Elijah. Air traffic control says the nearest suitable airport is Lambert International, about 200 miles southeast, she reported. But the storm system is between us and them. Elijah nodded without taking his eyes off the instruments. Any military airfields closer? Scott Air Force Base is about 150 miles, but they're reporting the same storm conditions, Sandra replied, checking the communication log. The plane shuddered as it passed through another pocket of turbulence. The right engine's pitch changed, causing Elijah's brow to furrow with concern. We're losing power in the remaining engine, he said, making quick adjustments. We need to conserve fuel and reduce strain. Tell the passengers to prepare for an emergency landing, but don't panic them. Reese still stood frozen in the doorway, her earlier confidence shattered by the reality of their situation. Can you land this plane? She asked, her voice barely audible over the storm and alarms. Elijah glanced at her briefly, then returned his focus to the controls. His face showed no fear, only intense concentration. This isn't my first impossible landing, he said with quiet confidence. He keyed the radio, his voice clear and authoritative. This is Lieutenant Commander Elijah Carter, United States Navy. I have control of Flight 2937. Both pilots are incapacitated. We have one engine failed, the second failing, and are experiencing severe system degradation. We need emergency landing clearance and medical teams standing by. The response came immediately, the air traffic controller's relief audible even through the static. Copy that, Commander. We're clearing all approaching traffic and giving you priority routing. What's your status? Maintaining controlled descent at 25,000 feet. Estimating 25 minutes of flyable time with current systems. Need the shortest possible route to a runway that can handle a Boeing 767 with potentially compromised landing gear. As Elijah spoke with air traffic control, the storm intensified around them. Rain lashed against the windshield in sheets. Lightning strikes came so frequently that the cockpit was almost constantly illuminated by their flashes. Visibility dropped dramatically, until Elijah could barely see the wingtips through the darkness and rain. Yet his hands remained steady on the controls, making minute adjustments based more on feel and instrument readings than visual cues. Sandra returned from briefing the passengers, her face grim but composed. They're scared but following instructions. I've positioned crew members at emergency exits and briefed them on possible water landing procedures, just in case. Elijah nodded. Good. We're being rerouted to Whiteman Air Force Base. It's closer and they have better emergency equipment. The military controllers are taking over our guidance. A particularly violent gust of wind hit the aircraft, sending it rolling to the right. Elijah fought the controls, muscles straining as he forced the plane back to level. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool air. We're losing hydraulic pressure, he said, his voice still steady despite the increasing difficulty. Controls are getting heavier. Without taking his eyes off the instruments, Elijah called out, Reese, I need your help now. Reese jumped slightly at hearing her name. She had been watching in stunned silence, the reality of their situation and her earlier treatment of Elijah, weighing heavily on her. What can I do? She asked, her voice small. I need another pair of hands, Elijah replied, gesturing to the co-pilot's seat. Come here. Now. Reese hesitated only a moment before moving forward, carefully stepping around the injured first officer. She slid into the right seat, eyes wide with fear as she took in the array of flashing controls. I don't know how to fly, she said, panic edging into her voice. I don't need you to fly, Elijah said firmly. I need you to be my co-pilot. Follow my instructions exactly. Lives depend on it. Their eyes met briefly. In Elijah's gaze, Reese saw no resentment for her earlier behavior, only calm determination. She swallowed hard and nodded. What do you need me to do first? Lightning flashed around the crippled aircraft, illuminating the cockpit in harsh white bursts that left afterimages floating before their eyes. Rain hammered the windshield with such force it sounded like gravel being thrown against glass. Inside, Elijah fought to maintain control as the second engine began to fail, its steady roar deteriorating into an uneven, sputtering growl. Engine 2 is losing power, Elijah announced, his fingers dancing across the controls, trying to coax more life from the dying machinery. We're down to 60% thrust and falling. The plane dropped suddenly, causing Sandra to grab the back of Elijah's seat to stay upright. The altimeter spun downward at an alarming rate. We're losing altitude too fast, Sandra whispered, her professional composure finally cracking as the reality of their situation became clear. Elijah checked the navigation systems, which flickered unreliably through the electrical interference from the storm. The primary GPS was completely dead. The backup was working intermittently, showing their position for a few seconds before cutting out again. Whiteman Air Force Base is still 70 miles away, he said, calculating quickly. We won't make it there on one failing engine. The plane shuddered violently as another bolt of lightning struck nearby. Several more warning lights illuminated on the console, including the critical hydraulic pressure indicator. Despite the mounting crisis, Elijah spoke with unnatural calm. His voice remained steady, almost detached, as if he were discussing a minor schedule change rather than their survival. There's a military airstrip 40 miles east, he said, pointing to a barely visible point on the backup radar during one of its brief moments of function. Scott Air Force Base Auxiliary Field. It's our only chance. Reese, now fully engaged in her role as makeshift co-pilot, looked at him with uncertainty. But the instruments are malfunctioning, she said, gesturing to the flickering displays and dark screens. How can we find it, let alone land there? I don't need them, Elijah replied. His eyes narrowed slightly, focused on something beyond the immediate chaos of the cockpit. In Afghanistan, I landed a burning F/A-18 at night with no electronics and half a wing. This is better than that. The confidence in his voice gave both women pause. For the first time since the crisis began, a flicker of genuine hope appeared in their eyes. What do you need us to do? Sandra asked. Get back to the cabin. Make sure everyone is in proper brace position. Secure anything that could become a projectile. This landing will be rough. Sandra nodded and hurried out, leaving Elijah and Reese alone in the cockpit with the unconscious pilots still strapped down behind them. Reese, I need you to be my eyes, Elijah said. Watch the altitude indicator whenever it's working. Call out our height every 1,000 feet. 23,000 feet. She responded immediately, finding purpose in the task. Elijah banked the aircraft gently to the right, setting a new course based more on memory and intuition than instruments. The control wheel was becoming increasingly difficult to turn as the hydraulic pressure continued to drop. Air traffic control, this is Flight 2937, he radioed. We are diverting to Scott Auxiliary Field. Request emergency crews and notify me of any other traffic in the area. The response came back broken and static-filled. Copy that. Emergency crews, standing by. No other traffic. Runway lights. Maximum intensity. The second engine's sputtering grew worse. The plane began to vibrate in a new, more concerning way. 19,000 feet, Reese called out. At this rate, we'll have about 15 minutes of controlled flight left, Elijah said. The field is about 12 minutes away if we can maintain this heading. If? Reese asked, her voice rising slightly. When Engine 2 fails completely, we'll have very limited control. I'll need to glide us in. Reese swallowed hard. Glide? Like a paper airplane. Elijah's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. More like a brick with wings, but the principle is the same. The storm's intensity seemed to increase as they descended, as if nature itself was determined to bring them down. The rain was so heavy now that even with the wipers at maximum speed, visibility through the windshield was almost zero. 15,000 feet, Reese announced. A loud bang shook the aircraft, and the remaining engine fell silent. The sudden absence of its noise was more terrifying than any sound could have been. The only sounds now were the howl of wind, the pounding of rain, and the electrical hum of the few remaining systems. Engine 2 is out, Elijah said unnecessarily. We're gliding now. The controls became even heavier as the last of the hydraulic pressure drained away. Elijah had to use both hands and all his strength to keep the aircraft on course. Sweat soaked through his sweater despite the cooling air in the cockpit. 10,000 feet, Reese said, her voice remarkably steady now. Elijah nodded. We should be able to see the airfield soon, if visibility improves at all. But the storm showed no signs of relenting. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying. Lightning strikes came so frequently that the dark clouds were almost continuously illuminated. 5,000 feet, Reese called out. Still no visual on the airfield. It's there, Elijah assured her, though he couldn't see it either. Trust me. At 3,000 feet, a brief break in the clouds revealed a faint cluster of lights ahead. The runway of Scott Auxiliary Field, lit up at maximum intensity as requested. I see it, Reese exclaimed. Gear down, Elijah ordered, and Reese pulled the landing gear lever. They both held their breath until 3 green lights confirmed the landing gear had deployed correctly. 2,000 feet, Reese reported, descending too rapidly. Elijah fought with the controls, trying to flatten their descent. Without engine power, he had to balance the aircraft perfectly to maintain the right glide angle. Too steep, and they'd hit too hard. Too shallow, and they'd fall short of the runway. As they approached the airfield, visibility dropped again to near zero. The runway lights vanished in the downpour. 1,000 feet, Reese whispered. I can't see anything. I can feel it, Elijah replied. His entire body seemed tuned to the aircraft now, sensing its movements, anticipating its responses. He flew by feel alone, an almost supernatural connection between man and machine. 500 feet, Reese said. Rate of descent still too high. Elijah keyed the intercom. 30 seconds to impact, he announced to the entire aircraft. Brace positions now. I repeat, all passengers in brace positions immediately. He could feel the runway approaching through the storm, sensed the right moment to pull back slightly on the controls to reduce their descent rate for touchdown. Brace, he shouted to Reese, who immediately folded forward, head down, arms crossed. The wheels touched down with a screech that filled the cabin. The plane shuddered violently, bounced once, then settled onto the runway. The reverse thrusters weren't working without engine power, so Elijah had to rely on the wheel brakes alone, pumping them carefully to avoid skidding on the rain-soaked tarmac. The aircraft slowed gradually, still shaking and vibrating as it shed speed. Eventually, it rolled to a stop near the middle of the runway, the storm still raging around it. For a moment, there was complete silence in the cockpit. Then Reese lifted her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. We made it, she whispered. You actually did it. Elijah released his death grip on the controls, his hands cramping from the sustained pressure. Outside, emergency vehicles were already approaching through the storm, their lights flashing red and blue through the rain. We made it, he confirmed, finally allowing himself a real smile. All of us. The storm had finally passed by the time emergency crews helped passengers disembark from the damaged aircraft. The sky was clearing, with patches of blue appearing between retreating clouds. Medical teams attended to those with minor injuries, while the more seriously hurt, including both pilots, had already been rushed to nearby hospitals. Cameras flashed as passengers stepped onto the tarmac. News crews had gathered with remarkable speed, alerted by air traffic control about the miraculous emergency landing. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones extended toward shell-shocked passengers who were still processing their brush with death. "Can you describe what happened?" A reporter called out to a woman clutching her child. "That man saved us," she replied, pointing to Elijah, who was speaking with Air Force personnel near the aircraft. When everyone else was panicking, he just took control, like he was born for this moment. More cameras turned toward Elijah, who seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Unlike the passengers, who wore blankets provided by emergency services, he still wore only his simple sweater, now wrinkled and stained with sweat and coffee. "Hero pilot said EV's 238 live Vs," the headlines would read tomorrow. By noon, his face would be on every news channel across the country. Sandra stood nearby, answering questions from investigators. Her uniform was disheveled, but her demeanor had returned to professional composure. She kept glancing at Elijah with undisguised admiration. "The company CEO is flying in personally to thank you," she told him when there was a break in the questions. "They're already talking about a Medal of Honor from the Airline Pilots Association." Elijah nodded politely but seemed uninterested in accolades. "How are the pilots doing?" he asked instead. "Captain Mercer is in surgery. The doctors are optimistic." First Officer Davis regained consciousness in the ambulance. "His concussion isn't as severe as we feared." Hours later, after debriefing military officials and airline representatives, passengers and crew were transported to a nearby hotel. The lobby buzzed with excited conversation, everyone reliving their shared trauma and miraculous survival. Many approached Elijah to shake his hand or hug him, some with tears in their eyes. "My daughter turns 5 next week," one man said, voice breaking as he gripped Elijah's hand. "Because of you, I'll be there to see it." In a quiet corner of the terminal, Reese stood alone, watching the scene unfold. She had changed from her uniform into company-provided casual clothes, but her name tag was still pinned to her shirt. She seemed smaller somehow, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. Eventually, she gathered her courage and approached Elijah when he was momentarily alone. Shame was evident in her posture, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I need to apologize," she began, her voice barely audible above the lobby chatter. "The way I treated you when you boarded, there's no excuse for it." Elijah studied her face. There was no satisfaction or vindication in his expression, only calm understanding. He raised a hand to stop her. "We all make judgments," he said simply. "What matters is learning from them." Reese looked up, surprised by his response. "You knew what was happening with the engine right from the start. I dismissed you, and it almost cost everyone their lives." "But it didn't," Elijah replied. "That's what's important now." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened, and what might have happened, hanging between them. "How did you stay so calm?" Reese finally asked. "Even when both engines failed, when we couldn't see anything, you never panicked." Elijah smiled slightly, his eyes distant as if recalling memories beyond today's events. "When you've been judged your whole life, you learn not to waste energy on what others think of you. You focus on what matters, doing what you know is right, regardless of whether others believe you can." He looked around at the passengers reuniting with worried family members who had rushed to the hotel. In the cockpit, all that mattered was bringing these people home safely. Nothing else, not the past, not personal feelings. None of that had any place in that moment. Reese nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "I want to learn that kind of focus," she said. "I want to be better." Before Elijah could respond, airline executives arrived, eager to meet the hero of the hour. The conversation was cut short, but something had changed in the way Reese carried herself as she walked away. 6 months later, Elijah stood before a classroom of flight crew trainees at the airline's training facility in Denver. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating a room filled with eager faces, new flight attendants preparing for their careers in the sky. The emergency landing had changed his life in unexpected ways. After 20 years of military service, he had accepted the airline's offer to become their chief safety instructor. His experiences, both as a test pilot and as a passenger who had noticed a problem no one else took seriously, made him uniquely qualified for the role. Among the trainees sat Reese, not as a student but as an assistant instructor. The crisis had transformed her as well. After careful reflection, she had requested a transfer to the training department, determined to ensure future crews would never make the mistakes she had made. Today, Elijah began, his deep voice carrying easily through the classroom. We're not learning just about flying. We're not even learning just about safety procedures or emergency protocols. He paused, making eye contact with several students before continuing. We're learning about seeing people for who they truly are, about listening when someone raises a concern, regardless of who they are or what they look like, about setting aside assumptions and biases that can cloud judgment in critical moments. Reese nodded from her position near the door, the lesson already deeply ingrained from that day in the sky when prejudice had nearly cost 238 lives. The students, familiar with the now famous story, looked between the two instructors with newfound understanding. In aviation, there's no room for prejudice, Elijah continued. When you're 7 miles above the earth, everyone, passenger, pilot, attendant, has valuable perspective. The moment we dismiss someone based on appearance or assumption is the moment we put lives at risk. As the class proceeded, Reese stepped forward to share her part of the story, not sparing herself any criticism, laying bare her mistakes as lessons for others. Later, as students filed out for their break, Elijah and Reese stood together before the large window overlooking the runway. Still planning to accept that captain's position next year? Reese asked. Elijah nodded. Flying's still in my blood. Teaching is important, but so is showing that barriers can be broken. You've changed this airline, Reese said quietly. And you changed me. We change each other, Elijah replied, watching a plane take off into the clear blue sky. That's how it's supposed to work.